There is, as long as there is divine being and divine consciousness, there is more consciousness going on in history. But is that always divine consciousness in and through the creation? And I don't find him saying it's not. But I don't want to prejudge it. The only other comment I can make, I think, is this, that if we are to know anything about the divine consciousness, it can only be through the creation. And if it can only be through the creation, then what that remainder of consciousness left over is, we've no way of knowing. Which I think follows. Look a little more closely here. The thesis, antithesis, synthesis triad in the historical unfolding of absolute spirit is in art, religion, and philosophy. And the initially interesting thing is to see how he differentiates those three. Some of you in literature or art may have found yourself asking, now, what is the difference between what literature is doing and what philosophy is doing when literary people get sort of philosophical? And Hegel would say it's the form in which, the way in which expression finds articulation. The arts are using images, artistic images. Sure, and to this day you hear people in literature talking of the images that are used in a writer. You hear Joel Sheasley over in the art department in painting talking of images. He recently had a show in Chicago that we went to see, one of the galleries in River North area. And yeah, all sorts of images of suburbia that seem to be truncated and chopped off. You see. And if you know Sheasley, you know what he was trying to convey by those visual images. Namely, the incompleteness, the paucity of life in suburbia, which is less than the whole story. His last show was a series of paintings about poverty in Latin America. Get the two in contrast. You can see what he's doing. But by the use of visual images. And the poet will use verbal images. Wordsworth's Ode to Daffodils, wandering lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er hill and vale. You see. Images in talking about the Romanticist vision of life. And so that's the nature of art, the German term Bild, image. Now, obviously, the term image is cognate of imagination, which is the distinctive activity of the artist. Not so much craft in applying the pigments as imagination in coming up with the images. Thinking imaginatively, that is to say, in images. And that, of course, is the Romanticist view of art. The expression of the human spirit, in imagination. And accordingly, as he traces out the unfolding of the history of art, you find that sort of thing given expression. He moves from, for instance, Egyptian art, which was more religious and symbolic, to classical art, which has more emphasis on rational harmony and order, to romantic art, which overflows the order in its imaginative expression. There's an unfolding of it as art finds its own self-understanding, conscious being. And then religion, which speaks symbolically, Vorstellung, a representation. It was Kant's word for a representation. But the representation is not the reality. The representation is the idea that stands for the reality. And the way Hegel uses it, the term symbol becomes significant, symbolic representation, pictorial representation. And so religious language is the language of a symbolic story, you see. Not necessarily parable, historical story, myth, and so forth. The term myth does not judge the question of historical or not historical. Mythos is a story that has religious meaning. So the religious form of expression then is this pictorial representation, symbol and so forth. And so he understands religion in those ways. Symbolic representation. And he traces the history of religious expression from Oriental religion, which was largely pantheist, everything is one, to Greek religion, which is polytheistic, there's the antithesis. There are many deities, finite deities, to the Christian religion, which is Trinitarian, 3 in 1 and 1 in 3, combining the infinity of God with the finite expression of the deity. Infinite spirit incarnate in all of history. That's what the incarnation means. The story of the incarnation is a symbol of the way in which God is immanent in everything that happens in history. The story is a picture of that. So he regards Trinitarian Christianity as the highest expression of religion. Christian theology as its symbols being appropriate. But notice that the question of historical truth is the leftover question there. But then it is in philosophy that you find the pure concept as the form of expression. The philosopher in his analysis of concepts tries to avoid metaphor, imagery, story, and to conceptualize with clear and distinct thought, you see. That's the function of philosophy, dealing with the begriff, the concept of being, not picture stories about, not images of, but conceptualizing in a non-sensory way. So you get these 3 forms then of expression of the consciousness of being. But keep in mind that while it may be the individual's self-expression at one level, more ultimately it's all the expression of the divine consciousness coming out through the individual and the cultural setting. Well, what you see then in Hegel's view of religion comes through fairly clearly. First of all, he has an immanentistic kind of theology. That is to say, God is immanent in everything else. The transcendence of God is in traditional Judeo-Christian thought. The transcendence of God, his numerical distinctness from the creation, that is lost. God is immanent. And consequently, any notion of supernatural act is regarded as religious symbol, picture, rather than as historically true. There is no act of divine revelation because everything that goes on within the human spirit is God's self-manifestation. All understanding is subsumed within that inner self-expression. This is related to the concept of the death of God, a phrase which he uses and later writers pick up. That is to say, the death of the picture of a transcendent deity. That's a concept of God which dies in the unfolding history of religious thought. Secondly, you have his criticism of certain other views of religion. So let's call this his criticism of Schleiermacher in his immediate context, and Kant on matters of religion. Kant, of course, had tended to reduce religion to ethics, and Schleiermacher criticized him for that. But Schleiermacher tended to define religion in terms of a feeling of dependence on the all-encompassing absolute, to which Hegel responds, if the feeling of dependence were the core of religion, then the most religious of all creatures is the dog. Yeah, even Hegel had something of a sense of humor. His point being that obviously there is something phenomenologically awry in that description of religion. Above feelings of dependence, you have the imagination involved in the arts. You have the symbolizing activity involved in religious stories. God is a son. God begat. God makes, he creates, he's creator. You see, the symbolism of religion is going significantly beyond. The